Tek, you can go ahead with the state updates.
Okay, so there really isn't much to report. Good morning, everybody. Thank you for being here with us. I'm sure everybody is happy to see the MIU notifications and the SIU GP registrations behind us. So big thank you to DEP for giving us extra time to do that. And I'm just looking forward to seeing DEP truly extend that industrial stormwater permit for us. It sounds like if that goes forward, which it seems like it will, we'll have till September 2024. Is that correct, Debbie?
Yeah, but just want to point out we should have the draft would come out in 2022.
Draft for the general permit that will succeed or will become effective
Right.
after 2024.
Right. So we're anticipating, so July 2022 is when it's going to go out for tentative decision. So I'm guessing they're anticipating, some back and forth between the regulated community, and then usually with this permit, you have to submit 90 days prior to expiration. So we have hopefully enough time in there.
Yes, I think someone is listening to us, because I do remember mentioning that, with those extensions, we should just extend it for 3 to 4 years, and that way we don't have to go back and redo it.
Mm-hmm.
So that's kind of all we had, right? On the wastewater front from our state.
Yeah, I guess just to point out, I did have some more recent communication with Kim Hudak about the changes to the 3I permit modifications. She indicated they were still working on it. And as you could see her quote, anticipating finishing up soon. So we'll see.
Right.
We'll see.
This is Jason. I have a question.
Sure.
Hi, good morning.
Morning.
The new SIU permit, and I guess the miscellaneous or whatever, they pretty much require the use of net DMR. Do you understand the process after you submit the registration, how they make those permits available to you in net DMR? Do you need to do something, or does the DEP do that on their end, or what? Or do you know?
So so my understanding, and there's going to be some changes to the net DMR folks is what I hear. There's I think Suzette is going to be retiring. So I have been talking with Lily Molina. And what she has told me is that let's see. You have to create an account similar to what you did for the other, like for your, let's say, a pretreatment permit. So it says on the top of the page, click on request access and start creating a pending request. So admittedly, I don't go into NetDMR. So I'm hoping this makes sense to you guys. And Wojtek, I don't know if you can maybe add to this.
Yeah, so I do recall when we went through the process of signing up with the NetDMR. So that account really lives on EPA's CDX portal. And so if you have an account there, similarly, if you have to report, let's say for Form R, that's the same way that you would get in. But there is paperwork and a process that you need to follow with DEEP because they have to play their part to help you, get connected to NetDMR, and obviously making sure that you have the authorization for the individual who will be completing the DMR, and then somebody needs to be appointed as a certifier. They usually give you the authority to submit and certify on their behalf. So that's kind of how it works. But I do remember that there were people at DEEP to contact to help you out with that.
Okay, thanks. I'll follow up with them. Yeah, we have NetDMR access. I just don't know how new permits get put into NetDMR, and that group is not an easy group to get anything out of.
Right.
So
Yeah.
I'll follow up with them. Thank you.
You're welcome.
Do you have Lily's email?
I do. Yeah.
Okay.
Thank you.
Yep. Also, I'm just curious, I've seen a couple come through. Are you guys seeing the your at least acknowledgement of your registration come through? Or still waiting on some of those?
Yeah, we received acknowledgement when ours was submitted.
Okay. Wojtek, did you get yours yet?
So we have the notice from DEEP telling us that they received our application.
Yeah. Okay.
And so my understanding is that this will take a while. We'll see how many months,
Yep.
maybe up to 6 months to maybe, for them to review it and let us know whether they need any more information or whether things are, sufficient the way they are.
Yep.
And just to know, closer to our topic today on PFAS, from talking to my permit writer, it seems like in the near future, or when we have to re-register for our new permit, this is on the individual pre-treatment permit, there will be a process where we will have to certify that we do not introduce and treat PFAS substances at our treatment plant. So it'll be interesting to see how that plays out and what we need to do to actually certify.
Yeah, I talked a little bit helping somebody else with a individual pre-treatment permit renewal, and they indicated that they're working on some standard language to either go into a permit as a compliance condition, or yeah, I guess that's what I think is going to happen. It's going to end up either you answer it in the application process or it becomes a permit condition. But definitely they're still trying to figure it out.
So what happens if you do have foam in your systems, and you have the potential to get it in, if you have a fire, the foam is for a fire, how can you certify that?
Right. So those are the questions that you'd have to kind of work out with your permit writer. I think if you have the potential and you know about it, maybe you'd have to, take measures if that happens to prevent it from getting to your treatment processes. So maybe the certification will be just along those lines. And, again, any other questions that definitely come up, I'm not sure if they will require, sampling of any sort.
Mhm.
So,
Right. Once we get those, the approved analytical methods for wastewater, I think they're going to be requiring sampling.
So Debbie and Wojtek, your speakers here.
yes, I did notice that.
Okay, great.
So do we want to transition over now to the main presentation?
Yep.
Yes.
Go ahead.
All right, sounds good. So good morning, everyone. Again, for those of you who don't know me, my name is Dmr Qa, and happy Friday to all. I'm working for Command Corporation for the last 15 years now. And for the past several years, I'm working alongside Debbie Hoyes to help facilitate CBIA's outreach to Connecticut businesses in the area of wastewater compliance. And today I have the great pleasure of introducing to you Chris Rascher of EPA Region 1, who is a TRI program manager there. Chris holds a master's degree in environmental engineering from Syracuse University, and he was a consultant prior to joining EPA over 30 years ago. And for past 15 years, Chris has been working in the TRI program. And just for the record, TRI is the Toxic Release Inventory, also known as Form R reporting initiative. And all of that stems from the Community Right to Know Act regulations. And before I turn things over to Chris, I just wanted to mention that if anyone has questions, please enter them into the chat and direct them either to myself or Debbie Hoyes, and we will help facilitate those questions and share them with Chris. So again, on behalf of CBIA and our members, welcome, Chris. Thank you for joining us, and good luck with your presentation today.
Hello, everyone. So again, my name is Chris Rascher, and I work in the Toxic Release Inventory Program. And I appreciate and thank CBI for allowing me to give this talk. Interestingly, first, this talk is going to be about PFAS as it relates to the Toxic Release Inventory, and it assumes that you're at least familiar with the Toxic Release Inventory and filling out the forms. I'll take questions whenever. I think they're going to be in chat, and then I would ask Marcy or Wojtek or Debbie to pass those questions on to me. As a trivial point of view, so I work for the federal government, and our laptops are controlled to some extent. We can't add programs to our laptops. So I'm using my personal iPad to use WebEx because we don't have WebEx at work. So there's a few technical glitches. I think Marcy is going to be changing the pages for me for this talk. So I'll ask Marcy each time to change the page. So I can't speak to, let me rephrase that. I cannot speak to PFAS generally as it relates to EPA. However, I can speak to it as it relates to the toxic release inventory. So again, I'm the pre-treatment coordinator. I've been working in TRI for a long time. I do enforcement and inspections as well as programmatic work. However, my emphasis is more on the inspections and enforcement side. On the first page, you have my phone number, and everyone can pass it along, and my email address. If anyone has a question whenever related to TRI, please feel free to give me a call or email. Essentially, and don't be concerned that I'm with enforcement. Essentially, I will respond to every single one of your questions and provide assistance wherever I can. No questions asked, and it does not, in your questions, whether they're good or perhaps inappropriate, will not put you on my inspection list. However, I will say that once I notify you that I am going to do an inspection of your facility, well, then things sort of change. So just to reiterate, feel free to call with any kind of question or email, and you will not be put on my inspection list. So Unless, of course, you say something criminal like, hey, I just finished dumping 1,000,000 pounds of something horrible into a lake. Do I need to report it on my TRI form? Then that would be an issue. But yes, you would have to report that on your TRI form if it was a TRI chemical. Okay, so with that, sorry, let me start. So interestingly, so normally when we do add new chemicals to the toxic release inventory, there's a very formal process that we go through, including information request letters being sent out to a number of facilities, getting some monitoring data and all of that sort of thing. The PFAS was very different in that Congress specified the PFAS chemicals in the, I want to make sure I say it correctly, the National Defense Authorization Act, which is a little different than the way we would normally go through the process. But anyway, sort of points to the idea that PFAS issue is so important that Congress is directly involved in how EPA is going to address PFAS. Okay, next slide, please. So I hope everyone knows. So you're required to report for PFAS chemicals this July based on last year's use of PFAS at your facility, right? So there's 172 PFAS chemicals. And they've all been codified. A little later on, I'll show you where you can find those chemicals. But I will say right from the start that if you just Google EPA, TRI, PFAS, it'll get you to a site on EPA's TRI website where you can get the entire list of PFAS chemicals that are regulated under TRI. Next slide, please. So for this year, there's 172. For next year, 3 additional chemicals are added, and they're listed here. But again, you can go to the website and get those specific chemicals. Duly note that the PFAS chemicals can often have these remarkably long, complex names that can just go on and on. So the CAS number is always provided with the chemical, so that you will likely have to use the CAS number to confirm whether your facility is using one of the TRI regulated PFAS chemicals. Next slide. So there's a couple interesting things with these PFAS. So one, the de minimis level, and I have 1 or 2 slides on the de minimis level, is 1%. So if the individual PFAS chemical is below 1% during the entire time it's at your facility, you're below the de minimis reporting threshold and you don't have to report. So to put that another way, so if you have milligrams per liter of a PFAS chemical at your facility, you don't have to report it, right? It has to be either 0.1 or 1%. So all of them are 1% except for one chemical. You can see it on the slide, which is 0.1%. So that's the important thing. The other thing, this in some ways, this is the most important slide. The reporting threshold is 100 pounds per individual chemical, right? So as opposed to something like the certain glycol ethers category, if some people are familiar with that, you take all of the chemicals that are included in the certain glycol ethers category, add them all up, and then you have that reporting threshold of 10,000 or 25,000 pounds. PFAS is different than that. Even though there's 172, they're not lumped together. Each one has its own individual reporting requirements. And that bottom threshold is 100 pounds for each one. So if you manufacture, process, or otherwise use more than 100 pounds of a PFAS chemical, and in general, the concentration is greater than 1 or is equal to 1% or greater than 1%, then you have to report. Next slide, please. So I actually also wanted to point out that if you were to go through, if you're looking for PFAS chemicals at your facility, one of the things you do, of course, is look at the SDS. You'll have to do more than looking at the SDS, but you'll look at SDSs. There's no, there's so many chemicals and the names are so large. I would offer that the first thing to do is to see whether the chemical name has fluoro in it, FLUORO. That specifically is one of the first ways that you can go to whether you should confirm that this might be a PFAS or whether you can automatically exclude it from the PFAS list. So first, it's got to have fluoro in there, and then you're likely going to have to go to that CAS number. So this is the website, the official website, and I think that you guys will get my slides so you can look at this. But again, if you just Google it, you'll get to essentially the same page, and that lists all of the PFAS chemicals in an Excel spreadsheet with all of the CAS numbers. That little thing, list of PFAS added to the TRI by the NDAA with the little red arrows, that little thing is a screen grab from the website. So that's what you would click on to get to your thing. So again, I want to emphasize, you're going to have to go chemical by chemical to identify the facility. You're going to have to confirm the CAS number within that Excel spreadsheet list. One of the big things that I also want to add is, well, what kind of process do I have to be using that likely has PFAS? And of course, we know that certain firefighting foams have PFAS chemicals. I think we all know that. And then I was going to list one or two things like coating, adhesives, paint sometimes have those, waterproofing agents have that. But I read this study in preparing for this, and I'll bring it up later on. But essentially, some researchers went through and tried to identify what industries have PFAS chemicals by looking at the TSCA list and actually, interestingly, reviewing patents for chemical usages. And essentially what they found was almost every industrial process might have a PFAS in it. So whether it was an old process or a new process, it's hard to exclude the potential for PFAS to be in one of your processes just based on what process you use. Next slide, please. So just to reiterate, the reporting threshold is 100 pounds, manufacture, process, or otherwise used. They're listed individually. It's not a chemical category. You have to review, I should say, facilities have to review all of their different processes and look at the chemicals individually to see if they meet the reporting requirements. I've had a couple telephone calls from people inquiring about all of this, and the only thing I can really say is you're really sort of stuck doing this the old-fashioned hard way, and that's going through each one of the materials that you receive, looking at their STS, looking at the supplier notifications. If for any reason that you suspect that a PFAS chemical might be present in one of the materials brought onto your site, you should also call that supplier up or the manufacturer of that material just to confirm whether the PFAS is there or not there. Okay, so you really are going to have to do some hard work just to confirm that these things are there. Simply stating that it wasn't on the SDS is not a defense for not reporting a PFAS chemical. You have to do a little bit more. Process knowledge, looking at supplier notifications, looking at perhaps your contract specifications for the material that's brought on site, and calling the supplier up to confirm that the PFAS isn't present is part of what you have to do. Next slide, please. So I'm a regulatory bureaucratic guy, and I truly enjoy these things. So there is the TRI program has a question and answers guide. Currently, it's all on the it's in a website or an internet site within the TRI program called Guide Me, and that has all of the questions and answers. I saw that there was a question. If the SDS says proprietary chemical and you suspect that it might be a PFAS chemical, then you should call the supplier up. Okay. There is one or two exceptions to that, but really you should be calling the supplier up and they should be telling you. So just to answer that one question. So again, this is question 562. I also want to say, so I took my slides from existing EPA TRI guidance, and this is one of the questions that they pose, and I like this one. So when a company has a mixture on site that does not have its own CAS number, what CAS number should I use? Well, you should use any CAS number that's within that mixture, okay? So look at each individual ingredient within a material that you bring on site. I'm not going to read exactly what this says. You can read it. You know how to do that, right? So if there's 5 different ingredients within a material that you brought in, you have to look at the CAS number for each individual of those 5 ingredients. Now, hang on a second. So just to reiterate, if you suspect that something's there, call the supplier up, call the manufacturer up. They're supposed to tell you. And I will say that I've encountered one specific case, although some came close, where a supplier of a chemical did not have the TRI chemical listed on the SDS, and there was no supplier notification given. So even though that supplier was a TRI reporter, they didn't tell the company they were supplying their material to that it contained TRI chemicals. So call them up and bug them if you suspect that there's something there. So, yes, so next slide, please. So you're required to use readily available data, and we hear that all the time. And that certainly includes the SDS, but it includes, any other kind of document you might receive from the supplier or the manufacturer. It requires you to look into something if if you reasonably anticipate that something might be there. It also requires you to use process knowledge and engineering judgment in that. So there's a facility, just to give you an example, where they received an SDS, and the information within the SDS was a little squirrely. It wasn't very exacting in saying what TRI chemicals were present. And they're using that as a defense against failure to report. And this is an enforcement case I'm working on right now. However, the material where the numbers were a little squirrely on the SDS is specifically added to something that they blend that they then advertise as having this specific chemical present. They have process knowledge that makes them know what the exact concentration of the TRI chemical is. So just because it's not on the SDS, they doesn't mean that you shouldn't know. Okay, next slide, please. So we talked about the de minimis previously. It's 1% except for perfluorooctanoic acid, which is 0.1%. Everything else is 1%, right? There's a lot of things that are added below 1%, and you don't have to include that. So if you have two PFAS chemicals present and you know the concentration is 0.6% for each of those PFAS chemicals, do you have to report them? Because if I were to add them up, it'd be 1.2%. And so the answer is no, right? I think as everyone realizes, you have to look at each one individually. Next slide, please. So sometimes you might have a situation where at one point in the process, perhaps when you specifically add that chemical to your mixture, when it's still in that drum or tote, whatever it's in, it's at one concentration, then you blend it in your material and it's below the de minimis. So for most of the time that it's in your facility, it's at that below 1% concentration. Does that count then, or add it to the wastewater and it's below the de minimis in the wastewater? No. Okay. So if it was ever at 1% at any time, 1% or greater, you have to report it, right? And that would imply that if you had it in a firefighting foam and then you used that firefighting foam and more than 100 pounds of that PFAS chemical was used, and it was above 0.1% in that tank before it was released. It was released, then you hosed it all down, it went into your wastewater treatment system. Do I have to report? Yes, because at one point it was greater than the 1%. Okay. Next slide, please.
Chris, can
So,
I just
yes.
interrupt you here for a second? We have a question. Are the PFAS chemicals OSHA hazardous substances that should be disclosed on the SDSs?
That's a good question. And I actually can't confirm that. I didn't double check that. I was thinking that too.
Mm-hmm.
I think that they are not OSHA extremely hazardous substances. So they would have to be above 1% to be reported on OSHA, wouldn't they?
Mm-hmm.
I'm speculating.
I'm
So there's a, go ahead, please.
no, I agree. And I think right, so the SDSs, all SDSs, if it's not above 1%, it doesn't need to be reported, right? Um, eh, in short, though, I think you're typically going to know based on your process if you have these chemicals or not. Now, there are a couple of things that but generally you're going to know, I guess would be my take. It's not something that would be kind of snuck in there. I don't know if you
You,
agree with that, but
I can't say yet.
yeah,
So I haven't started looking at these chemicals during inspections. I'm going to start, and I have a couple facilities um, tentatively identified for inspections next year where I'm going to start looking. We, like I said, if you're a textile industry and you're applying a waterproof coating to fabric,
right. Yep.
perhaps
Mm-hmm.
it's
Sure.
there.
Yep.
And that if I was in that industry, I would definitely spend a lot of time trying to confirm whether PFAS are present or not. There's a couple others. Anything, if I hear the word waterproofing or
Mm-hmm.
firefighting foam,
Right. Yep.
my suspicion is there. But it's also in coating, like for electroplating, like sometimes even machining operations. Sometimes if you machine, like let's say copper, and then you might dip it in some kind of coating to make sure that it doesn't oxidize, that might have PFAS. Again, it'll be interesting to see. But yeah,
Mm-hmm.
if I'm a fabric coater or if I have firefighting foam, I'd go out of my way to confirm whether it's present or not present.
Right. Yep.
And as you
Okay.
said, is it required to be reported on the SDS? Boy, not necessarily. Likely, yes, not necessarily. It's fascinating. I have given talks on relying on SDSs, and it's fascinating what people who write SDSs put in there, and there's an awful lot of really high quality SDSs out there, but sometimes the information is purposefully obfuscated. And I give an example where there was this, I was looking at a facility and the question is, are they over or under the reporting threshold? And the SDS had for this material 20 to 80% of this TRI chemical. So the company picked the midpoint. But I called the facility, I called the supplier up and I said, what is the concentration of chemical X? And they said 72.8% always. And they knew it off the top of their head. And essentially they said, if for some reason we have to get our material from a different supplier, we won't know what the concentration is. Right now, it's always this percentage. So that's number one. And number two, I was at a facility where, you know, I was inspecting them. I looked at their SDS and they had a concentration range for a couple different TRI chemicals in the material I was looking at. And I said, well, you know, if you pick the midpoint, you're over the reporting threshold. So it looks like you might have to report. And the person said, no, my supplier purposefully obfuscates the SDS. So it has this much larger range. Here's the contract agreement I have with the supplier that specifically states what the concentration of that TRI chemical is in the mixture that I received. And it was well below the midpoint. And essentially what they said is, my supplier and I request that they put in some very large range within the S, so that way they don't know what concentration I'm really using. Okay. So people really rely on SDSs, but there has to be, a facility should go beyond the SDS to confirm what the actual concentration is. Okay.
Okay, thanks.
Are there any other questions before I start up again?
Nope, I don't see any.
Okay, good. So I think we're going to slide. Well, just to say this again, suppliers are required to tell you, but yet somehow some might not, and they might not give you the right concentration. So you can really bug them about that. It's reasonable for you to call up the supplier and the manufacturer and try to get a more accurate number. After all, you're buying the product, you're giving them money. They should be able to tell you what the number actually is. There might be some proprietary issues, but they better give you a better number than, you know, somewhere between 1% and 99%. Okay. Next slide. So I think I've beaten this dead horse. Don't rely on the SDS alone. Try to go into other things. Use your process knowledge, use your engineering judgment to figure out what's present and what's not. So, okay, next slide. So unlike every single other program in the EPA, I don't know if that's really true or not, but certainly most programs, in the TRI program, you're not required to take your own samples of the material. Okay, so I cannot tell you as a toxic release inventory inspector to analyze this material so you can tell me what the concentration of something is. Right? You're supposed to use, again, SDS's, process knowledge, any other information you have. However, if you do have monitoring data from a different program, and I'll always point out to the MPDES program and permit application sampling, usually you have to do a priority pollutant scan when you do a NPDES water permit, when you apply for one. At least that's the way it is in most states. Embarrassingly, I can't confirm that for Connecticut, but I think that at one point you were supposed to do a priority pollutant scan. But anyway, so if you have monitoring data from another program like water, air, or even RCRA, then you have to use that data within your TRI estimates. Okay. So again, so question 569 essentially directs you to use other information as needed and process knowledge to get at a number. Okay, next slide. So this is a big one for, I included this in here because I was envisioning people with firefighting foam, and I think it's good that if you have flammable substances at your facility, that you have some type of fire suppression system, and firefighting foams are, of course, part of that. In this specific thing talks about federal facilities. But even if you're a regular factory or manufacturing facility and you have firefighting foams and you go, holy cow, my firefighting foam, which I've never used, has PFAS in it, just to avoid any problems in the future, I'm going to dispose of it. So do I have to report that unused firefighting foam as a release when I send it to a TSD facility? And the answer is no, I don't. And I think I have one or two slides of this. See, I'm embarrassed I can't remember. The idea is even if you fill up or you purchase firefighting foam with um, PFAS in them, you don't have to report them in TRI until it's used and it's over and you use more than 100 pounds of that PFAS chemical, right? So if I buy a pressurized tank of firefighting foam, I don't actually know how it's purchased, but we'll say it's in a pressurized tank of firefighting foam, and then I choose not to use it and I throw it out. Or even if I bought some new chemical for a coating operation, it's sitting in a drum and I've never used any of it. And then I decide, I'm just going to get rid of it. I'm sending it over to a TSD facility, treatment storage and disposal facility, like a RCRA disposal facility. You don't have to report it. The TSD facility will have to report it, right? Because they're going to do something with it. They're going to open up the can. They're going to do something. So likely they're going to have to report, but you, the facility that originally disposed of it and never used it, does not have to report it. Okay. So I want to point out that this is subtly different than some other processes. So I was similar but very different from this is when you have ammonia refrigeration system and you bring in ammonia and hydrous ammonia and it's going through your system, recirculating around, doing what ammonia refrigeration is supposed to do. The year that you bring it on, you have to report ammonia for otherwise using if it exceeds 10,000 pounds. So the year you bring it on. The next year, you don't add any ammonia to it. You just keep on using it. You don't have to report it, but you have to report it that first year. Or if I reported it that first year and then the next year, I accidentally have this horrible release and I release more than 10,000 pounds of ammonia and I have to fill my ammonia refrigeration system back up with 10,000 pounds or more, then I would have to report that again and I'd have to report that release, right? In this situation, so with regard to the PFAS and firefighting foam, I brought it on site, but it's just sitting in storage is what they call that. And that's why you don't have to report it. So while it's in storage, you don't have to report it. It's only if it's released. If you take that stored material and dispose of it, take it to a TSD facility, you don't have to report it. Okay? The TSD facility likely will have to report, but you don't have to report. So next slide. Oh, I also want to point out for federal facilities, unlike manufacturing facilities, there's an executive order for federal facilities that they have to report TRI chemicals even if they're below the reporting threshold. So just so you're aware of that, if you're a federal facility. So I think I might have gotten ahead of myself. So again, firefighting foams very specifically can have PFAS chemicals in them. Not all of them, certain ones. Turns out they were pretty effective firefighting foams, but again, PFAS chemicals. So here's the specific question. So if you're using firefighting foams, again, you're releasing it for training purposes, that has to be reported. It's all a question of whether you release it or whether it's stored in that tank. Okay, there's no exemptions for that. So, and just again, if it matters, it's 100 pounds, but if you're using a firefighting foam, it would be classified under otherwise used as opposed to processing. Next slide. So this is a Q&A from the EPA guidance on TAI. What they did was they took existing questions and answers and thought it applied to PFAS, then they included them. And this is one of them. And this goes along that same sort of thing. If you're using the firefighting equipment and it has a TRI chemical in it and it exceeds the reporting threshold, then it would have to be reported. Okay, in this case, it's benzene, but you can put in PFAS for the same thing. This talks about the laboratory exemption. For those familiar with the laboratory exemption, it's a very specific exemption with a very narrow definition. So be careful when using that. I do review that thoroughly, and I have found facilities that misinterpret that laboratory exemption. Okay. Next slide. I hope I'm not beating the dead horse. This is the same thing with fire suppression equipment. If you're not using it, you're only storing it, and as long as you're storing it, you don't have to report, right? That's the big thing. Once it's released, it's otherwise used. It's storage, and that doesn't count. And that goes for all other TRI chemicals, right? If you bring it on site, you don't use it, and then you dispose of it, you don't have to report it. That's assuming all of it. If you bring on 1,000,000 pounds and you don't use 100,000 pounds and you dispose of that 100,000 pounds, that would have to be reported because you had a report for the other 900,000. Okay. I hope that's clear. Next slide. Okay. Same thing. Storage is different than disposal. As long as you don't release that chemical on your site, it likely doesn't have to be reported. Okay, next slide. One more time. Okay, they're using PCBs, but it's the same sort of thing. Again, if you're not processing it, if you're not releasing it, it doesn't have to be counted towards the reporting threshold. And if you still have PCB laced transformers on site, this might be applicable to you. That, of course, was a big to-do a while ago. I get very few TRI reporters that report for PCBs nowadays. There still are one or two, though. Next slide. So what are we going to do in the future? EPA continues to actively look at all the various PFAS chemicals. There's going to be, I guess, 173 next year. The year after that, there very well may be more PFAS chemicals that will have to be reported. There might be fewer. EPA is actively looking at this. They're trying to determine whether more PFAS chemicals have to be reported. There's an authority. So there's an authority, just like the NDAA in the beginning. There's a couple of authorities that we have to add more chemicals, and that's probably going to be used to add new PFAS chemicals. So every year you should be checking the EPA website to make sure what the list of PFAS chemicals are. So we know what they are for this year that are, again, due July 1st, which is just weeks away. And then next year, there'll be a few others. There very well may be even more than that. I don't know. I truly don't know. So that's basically it. Next slide. There are some PFAS chemicals that are protected from disclosure. I'm not that familiar with the rules. That's a headquarters determination. Again, I'm only going to reiterate that you should be calling your supplier up just to try to confirm it. So if it's protected from disclosure, that's not unlike confidential business information. It's different though, but anyway, there could be a few that are protected. I'm not sure if any facilities in New England have that issue with their PFAS. Next slide. Again, the NDAA requires EPA to look at PFAS chemicals, to add more chemicals, remove more chemicals, alter perhaps the reporting threshold or the de minimis as more information comes in. So this is still a learning experience for the TRI program and EPA as we go forward with this PFAS. So literally this is not a hard number that we have this year. Things are going to be evolving as years progress. Next slide. And so this is the end of the talk, and these are available resources. There's a number of resources at the EPA website explaining PFAS. It goes into in a great deal of detail on how to report and what to look for. There's also some estimates for air emissions that can be obtained. I think there's more information that's going to be developed. We all know it. There's going to be a lot more. EPA spending a lot of resources to look at PFAS. And so these are websites that you could look at. I think the slides will be available to everyone. So you can use that to look up more things. So I mentioned this one paper that I looked at. Of course, I'm not recommending this paper. I'm just saying that I looked at it. But basically what that one paper said was PFAS could be in almost everything, and they went through a long process. It was in this journal called Environmental Science Processes and Impacts, and the title was called Overview of Uses of Perfluoro and Polyfluoroalkyl Substances, PFAS, and the lead author was Julianne Glug, Gluge, and it was published in 2020, so just last year. If you have questions, you can call me or email me, and I'll give you the resource for that. It's not that there's specific information. It essentially just says, we looked at it, holy cow, it could be anywhere. So that's it. And with that, if you have any questions, now is the time to ask. Of course, you can ask me separately as well, but I'd love to answer a couple questions on PFAS or on TRI in general. I saw the question popped up, but could someone repeat it? I wasn't able to read the whole question.
Sure. So we have a question about other materials that we should do a deeper dive on to confirm no PFAS. So other than the firefighting foam or waterproof coatings.
Adhesives, evidently. I don't know. And
Yeah.
if it wasn't clear to me, clear to anyone, I don't know, and EPA doesn't know. Yes, firefighting foams, coatings that include waterproofing is a classic. It can be in a number of things. I just can't answer. PFAS has a number of different properties that can make it useful to different industrial sectors. I don't know. You really have to look. I guess if you're doing metal machining and you're not doing any coating operations on those metal parts, you're literally machining it, you're throwing out your turnings or recycling your turnings. You may not have any, but see, it could be used in the lubricants that are used for your turnings, right? So it could be in there too. So my answer is I don't know.
Sounds like just an exhaustive review of your SDSs.
And that's a start.
Yeah.
And that's a start. And any indication that suggests that there's some kind of, coding type of thing. But it's a tough one.
Mhm.
And EPA, it went through this NDAA, which was a different process that we normally do. And if the TRI program were to use the normal process, these regulations wouldn't come out for a couple more years. So Congress wanted things to come out quicker, so they used this process to implement it. I think what's going to happen is that a number of people have called me up, are going to use the TRI information when it becomes available to help understand where PFAS may be found. So
Okay.
we don't know.
Yep.
Okay. That was a little quicker. I thought my talk would go a little longer, so I hope that was a reasonable amount of information. And again, if you have any
Yeah.
questions regarding TRI, please feel free to call. I will say that if you are a TRI reporter, it's still tentative. It's not absolutely confirmed yet. We're going to try to have a virtual TRI training for Region 1 in the middle of June, we're hoping for, which is a little late, which is pretty close to the July 1st deadline. But there'll be 2 sessions, a basic one and then an advanced one. I think they're going to be a 2-hour basic and then a 2-hour advanced training to discuss TRI and any questions you might have there. So I'll advertise that right now.
Great.
Okay.
Okay.
So good. Thank you very much, everyone.
Yeah. Thank you. And Chris, we did send out the slides, so people will have your contact info.
Wonderful. Great.
Thank you, Chris,
Okay.
for joining us here again today.
Great. You're
Yeah.
welcome. Have a wonderful day,
Thanks.
everyone.
Just to expand on the trade secret that we kind of touched on here in the review of a SIU general permit registration recently submitted, it sounds like the water permitting and enforcement division is no longer accepting that. So I have had to go back to chemical suppliers and have received a variety of responses from absolutely not to sure, here's what it is. So um just an FYI, I've they are, as Chris pointed out, they're supplying you with the material, so you do have the right to know what's in it. Um does anybody else have anything to add? I do have Brian Conti is on the line and wanted to discuss um, the DMR Quality Assurance Study Program. I know there are a few of you who are direct dischargers who I believe participate in this program. Brian, can you unmute yourself?
Sure. Thanks,
There you
Debbie.
are. Hi.
Yeah. Thank you. Yeah, and Debbie and I had spoke, and I was just wanted to discuss the DMR QA a little bit, and also kind of raise a question to CBIA in general. But for those who aren't familiar, the DMR QA basically is for NPDES permit holders that submit DMRs, and it's a way to independently check the quality of the data by sending standards to laboratories for the analysis that you perform under the DMR. So it's just that, it's a QA of the DMR data. So one of the reasons I wanted to talk was I had received, so we're on DMR QA study 41, and I had received a version of it from Don Gagne, and then a mailed version was going out. But One of the things that's required under the study is to submit an address verification form. On the form that I received from Don, the due date is today, so it's very timely. It's a very simple process to submit an address verification, let them know that they have the right information. But on the website, on the EPA website, it's actually June 4th. So there's a little discrepancy there. I assume the one on the EPA website is correct. All the other dates seem to be the same. So the study began on April 23rd. That's when you can order your standards and talk to the lab about having those analyzed. The study date ends on August 27th. That's when you have to have all your standards in there, and then you have to report out on October 22nd, 2021, the results. And if for some reason any of the labs failed to provide within their QA range, then you have till December 17th to submit a corrective action report and a retest to indicate that the lab can actually perform the analysis correctly. I indicated that I wanted to have a discussion with the group, and I really don't know much about this other than 17 states have either partially or fully exempted from this program, and they're listed on the EPA website. And I was curious, we've talked at CBIA about having Connecticut reduce some of the regulatory burden or try to take some of the responsibilities away. So just curious if that's something that CBIA or others, and again, I don't know that process and I don't know how they got exempted, but I just thought I would bring that up in this forum. But that's any other questions? I'm certainly by no means an expert, but we do at Millstone participate in this program every year.
Okay, thanks, Brian. And I think you also were questioning, so Don Gagne is the current state-specific contact.
Correct.
We don't know after Don's departure who that is going to be yet. He's still listed on the webpage.
Correct. And again, that address verification form gets emailed to him directly. So, and if the date is extended, I'm not sure when his last day is, but if it doesn't get extended out to June 4th, it may, I don't know, it may bounce back.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Okay, so I think we can have some further discussion if you guys who do have direct discharges and participate in this program, we want to discuss that more, maybe in a smaller group. Let us know.
Thanks, Debbie.
Thank you, Brian. Anybody else have any water related issues they want to talk about? Otherwise, it looks like we're moving on to Ashley and John.
Well, thank you, Debbie, for doing that transition.
Mm-hmm.
Good morning, everybody. How are you? It's happy Friday. It's been a long week for us, for Ashley and I and Marcy. Just to set the context a little bit before I jump into our more detailed update, I'm going to go first just because Ashley has some things on the back end of hers that she'd like to go over with Harold with you guys after I go through my energy section. So just to set the context, as I said, in the last 3 weeks of session, this is where the rubber meets the road. The virtual nature of things has been super difficult for, I think, anybody, whether you're doing regulatory work or, in our case, doing the legislative work. Most energy bills in my have not moved. They will or will not move within the next 3 weeks. A lot of discussions are more dominated with regards to how to spend federal dollars, the tax implications of the Democratic package got put forward. As they get people to vote for whatever budget they like, they'll probably try and get buy-in on some of the bills that they want to move in energy and environment. So I would expect over the next couple of weeks we'll see a lot of movement or none in the following with with regards to the following bills in energy and environment. So in energy, we're continuing to follow the decoupling bill, Senate Bill 855. It's in the Senate. I'm not super confident that that is going to move anywhere. Haven't heard a lot on it, but it's there, and we continue to monitor it. As far as Senate Bill 882, that's the climate change mitigation, home energy affordability. This is the governor's bill that states that it would like to mandate that as of January 1, 2040, the level of zero carbon for electricity supplied to electric customers in the state would be at zero, and it would require EDCs to file zero carbon reduction models over the next few years. Senate Bill 950, also awaiting action in the Senate, is a vegetation management and utility pole bill. Not sure if that's going to go at all, but we'll continue to track that. I want to touch on a couple of bills here that did get some movement. Senate Bill 952, an act concerning certain solar energy project, which creates solar energy goals, increases virtual net metering, and permits EDs to own solar generation facilities. Got passed out of the Senate this past week and is awaiting action in the House. Similarly, Senate Bill 999, which is an act concerning just transition to climate protective energy production and community investments, been a pretty controversial bill. It came out of labor. There was an amendment in the Senate this week that would limit the benefits that would have to be provided to projects, class 1 resources that are more than 2 megawatts or more. The original bill had 5 megawatts and a $2.5 million threshold for these benefits to be invoked into those projects. But the amendment changed it down to 2 megawatts and is relatively small as far as the amount of houses that particular megawatts could supply for. House Bill 6524, an act concerning soliciting of fuel cell energy electricity generation projects, is awaiting action in the House. This is the bill that's from may to a shall, which would require EDCs to acquire new fuel cell electricity generation projects, and it limits the size of those to 30 megawatts of capacity. The last bill I'm going to touch on here, and then I'll turn it over to Ashley, is House Bill 6526. It's an act concerning electric suppliers. It passed out of the House. It's waiting action in the Senate. The bill was amended in the House and clarified a couple new requirements that it would only apply to contracts and agreement, residential contracts and agreements, and prohibits suppliers from charging variable rates. Deems contracts that do have variable rates to be null and void. Removes one of the most controversial provisions is it removes a prohibition on automatic renewal and provisions to supplier contracts, and also removes a requirement of suppliers to have a residential customers affirmative consent in order to enter into a new contract. So those are the bills that are top of my agenda. If there are any other ones that you're concerned about, please let me know. We only have a few weeks left, so anything we can do to help limit or help push an issue forward, be happy to do so. I'll pass it on to Ashley.
Morning, everybody. Happy Friday. So we have about 14 days left in session, as John mentioned. Many of the environment bills aren't really moving as much, so they're staying in their respective chambers. We did get some movement on SB 837, which moved out of the Senate as amended. And this has to do with PFAS and Class B firefighting foams. So what the bill generally does is prohibits the use of Class B firefighting foams with intentionally added PFAS. There are some exemptions built in, including if you're federally required. It also has some language in there that says if DEEP doesn't come up with any alternatives, you would still be allowed to use these foams for specific types of firefighting. This bill also had an amendment on it that included packaging for consumer products. This doesn't include medical or anything that has to do with non-food packaged materials. So if you've added in PFAS intentionally to this packaging, it will be banned starting in October 1, 2023, I believe. Other than that, a lot of the environment bills are kind of staying within their chambers. It looks like TCI is getting some pushback and that they're still trying to work that out between budget negotiations and just general environment areas. In terms of regulatory issues, as we all know, the spill reporting regulations had their public comment period that ended on May 10th at 5 p.m. CBIA did submit written comments, and I'll just kind of go over some of the high level things that we mentioned. So the first thing, we did support the gallon threshold for oil and petroleum spills. And then we brought up some concerns, including the use of properly trained personnel. There's some inconsistencies within the regs, so we want that cleared up. The 1 hour time frame to get a responder to a location of a spill we mentioned was extremely unrealistic. It's not like spills don't happen at 1 a.m, and getting somebody out there in a third shift would be extremely difficult. We also talked about the secondary containment definition as it pertains to enclosed buildings, and also the fact that it's a containment. So the whole point is to contain the spill and not have a spill. We also talked about the definition of potential risk to human health and the environment. As you know, we're starting to see that pop up in language, but there's no exact definition for what that means. So we would like some clarity on that. Also, the follow-up reporting requirements, if information isn't available within the first hour, what's going to be required after that. And then we also did provide some suggestions on how to make some changes, including exemptions for if a spill occurs on an impervious surface within a building, to exempt that from being reported. And then other things, including exempting incidental releases under Osha 1910-120. So if you have any specific questions on that, please feel free to let me know. Or if there's any bills in the Environment Committee that you're concerned about, again, please let us know. We are in the final stretch and the final countdown for session.
Ashley, or Marcy, can you post the CBI comments on our website?
Yes.
Thanks. So Ashley, John, you guys all set?
Unless there's any questions, and if anybody needs any more specifics on any of the bills, just let us know.
Okay, so we'll move on to energy, and not King Lear, but King Lee.
King Lee, I got promoted. Well, this is great. So just a couple of things for today. If you've been following along in the papers, 2 weeks ago, give or take, on May 6th, Pura issued its notice of violations to, sorry, Chuck, Eversource and United Illuminating as part of docket 200803 reopener 1, which is Pura's consideration of civil penalties against electric distribution companies after Storm Isaias investigation. And if you have consideration of civil penalties in the title, you kind of sort of know how this is going to go. And so, I don't know about the rest of you. I'm not seeing a ton of notices of violation in the environmental sphere, but Pura has found notices of violation and they know how to use them, and they're using them quite frequently. Here, what they've done is they've issued 2 notices of violation. The one to Eversource is fairly substantial, and it's claiming the following. It's claiming that Eversource failed to properly monitor the storm and then classify the storm and the resulting emergency correctly, and then failed to revise how it dealt with the storm and those determinations, and failed to properly communicate how serious the storm was. Frankly, nobody predicted that that storm was going to be what it was, but Eversource has apparently the responsibility of proving the meteorologists wrong. Also failed to procure and send out sufficient resources for line crews within 48 hours, failed to send out sufficient damage assessment crews within 48 hours. And this is where I think Pura really responded to proposals from the heart rather than from the head. A lot of towns lined up to pillory Eversource about their town liaison program. And if you recall, from the 2-storm panel, one of the problems that happened after Winter Storm Alfred and the other storms was that the towns wanted certain things turned on first, or wanted certain things dealt with first, and Eversource was running through its playbook, and they weren't talking to one another. And so the idea was that each town would have a liaison with Eversource or with UI that would be able to communicate with it and set the priorities and have a conversation. And apparently, although that worked well in Superstorm Sandy and was complemented in Superstorm Sandy, it fell apart here, at least according to Pura, and Eversource failed to manage the town liaison process properly, failed to coordinate the processes with the towns. And I think the most chilling thing was that Pura bought off on the concept that Eversource also failed to prioritize the first responders appropriately. And there were several towns who testified to that. And I think that that's part of what got Pura's knickers in a twist. In addition, Eversource supposedly failed to meet standards of performance for customer communication and failed to report 36 minor accidents. That 36 number will come up in a minute. This was all done in the prior docket. Those facts were all found. So translating this into, say, the Superfund context, which may be easier for everybody to understand, Eversource, and I'll get to United Illuminating in a minute, United Illuminating can't fight these findings. It's much like the bifurcation of liability versus amount of liability in a Superfund context, if you can remember that far back. Basically, there was already a docket that found all of this evidence, and right or wrong, Eversource now has to contend with this. Eversource obviously has a right to appeal that, and whether it avails itself or not of that, I don't know. But for right now, dealing with that NOV, this is what Eversource has. And the fines are pretty substantial. So the maximum fine for failure to respond to an emergency is found at section 16-32I, and it's 2.5% of Eversource's revenue, and up to 2.5%. And Pura decided to hit them with the maximum penalty, which is 28.4 million. In addition, the failure to report 36 accidents is a $500 per violation fine, according to section 1616. And this is where it gets interesting, because Pura decided to sock Eversource with all 36 accidents at $500 a pop, and they found that they didn't report those accidents for 90 days. So when you multiply 36 by 500 by 90, you get 1.6 million, which is really, in my estimation, adding insult to injury. And the total fine for the failure to report is 1.6 million, and the total fine for everything is just north of 30 million. Eversource has until May 26th to request a hearing on the NOV. Otherwise, they simply have to pay the fine. I assume that they're going to request a hearing, but I don't know that. But I think for $30 million, it would behoove them to do so. UI got hit with the same statutes and the same potential penalties, and has the same timing for whether or not they want to request a hearing. They also got hit with their NOV on May 6th. The difference is, for UI situation, it was really only the city of Bridgeport that had a lot of complaints about how UI handled its situation. And Bridgeport did speak up and did claim that UI wasn't supporting its first response efforts and everything else. And so Pura hit UI for failure to coordinate properly with Bridgeport and with the liaison program, but only hit them with a 0.5% of their revenues fine, rather than the 2.5% that they hit Eversource with. And so that totaled out to 1.78 million. And then they also found that UI failed to report 8 minor accidents. And so they multiplied those 8 accidents by the 90 days by the $500 and got to 360 grand for a total fine that's just north of 2.1 million. And again, UI has a right to appeal, as does Eversource. And when you take that into context, there's another thing going on, which is very interesting, which is we also have third-party electric suppliers. You have a standard rate for either United Illuminating or Eversource that you get on your electric bill for the generation of the electricity. Not talking about the distribution charges for transmitting that electricity, nor are we talking about the other charges like conservation, load management fund, and those kinds of things. But
just the cost of generating the electricity. You can take the standard rate from one of the two utilities, or you can go to a third-party supplier that procure their electricity out on the open market. Constellation, TransCanada, Direct Energy, Clearview, whatever. And there are dozens of suppliers out there who are willing to sell you electricity, sometimes at a variable rate, sometimes at a singular rate, sometimes with environmental benefits, what have you. There's dozens of these companies out there. Well, Pura decided that it believed that these companies were charging their customers incorrectly. And it has to do with what's called the next cycle rate. And essentially, when you sign up with one of these companies or when you change the contracts, they have to relay that change in price to the utilities who then put it on your bill and you pay the bill. Well, they weren't always syncing up the next cycle rate with the billing cycle for each customer. And the result was that the customer was charged a different rate than what showed up on its bill. Pura focused in the 2016 to 2019 timeframe when the rules changed. And Pura's claim is that the providers didn't correct the bill cycle rate the next cycle rate, excuse me, quickly enough on the bills so that the customers got the benefit of the new contract. Now, presumably in some of these cases, the customers got a benefit of paying a cheaper price for a bill cycle until everything got synced up, but Pura didn't seem to care about that. What Pura did was in 2020, Pura sent out a blanket notice to all of the suppliers saying, we think that you've screwed up the next cycle rate rule, and we're willing to provide you with amnesty up to and including the end of January of 2019 for these mistakes. But in exchange, you're going to have to come up with a plan for how you're going to repay the customers what you overcharged them for. As again, presumably there was an undercharge as well, but Pura didn't want to hear that. So 25 companies responded to this amnesty proposal, and 22 of the companies went ahead and submitted amnesty plans. And the total is $9.4 million that's now flowing back in increments to the ratepayers who were overcharged. And the companies have until the end of the year to pay back this $9.4 million. It's going straight into their customers' bills as a credit. What's interesting about all of this is at the end of the amnesty order, Pura noted that if you didn't participate in the amnesty program, Pura would subject you to additional investigations and you might have to pay fines. And I will tell you that Pura has taken that responsibility very seriously, and Pura is investigating other companies, and they are issuing NOVs, and those NOVs are in the high six figures. There is no concept of a penalty matrix. There's no concept of whether or not there are extenuating circumstances. It's you violated this for this many days, therefore you're going to pay X or Y or whatever it is. And I think that Pura thinks that it's getting paid as a percentage of what it's raising in revenue for the state coffers under its NOVs. And I think that's something that we need to take a look at more closely as this continues, because Pura has gotten a new branch that is dedicated solely to enforcement, and they're taking their charge very seriously, and it is a whole new ball game out there. And that, Chuck, is my report, but I am happy to entertain questions.
You didn't talk about our nice commercials that we've been running the last several weeks.
Your nice commercials have been fantastic, but no, I didn't talk about that. You're right. I'm sorry.
Now, obviously, I'm not at liberty to speak about anything about what he talked about in the first half in terms of the various orders and notices of violations that have come out from Pura. It is a new ball game. That's true.
It's a whole new ball game, and Chuck, I am at liberty to say, because I don't have a dog in the hunt.
Right.
I think that everybody thought that tropical storm was going to be significantly less bad than it was. That's not really a scientific term, significantly less bad, but roll with it. It's Friday. we got the weather forecast wrong. We all did. I mean, everybody did. They didn't send Jim Cantori from the Weather Channel. It couldn't have been a serious storm. And yet Eversource, because of that, Eversource is being pilloried for not being sufficiently responsive. And when you look at the response that Eversource actually pulled off in light of that, yeah, there were a couple of mistakes and a couple of things could have been done better, but it's not what they did was pretty much in line with what industry standards are. And while there's probably a fine that's due and owing, it's a factor of 10 higher than I think is reasonable. That's just one man's opinion. And we'll see if the hearing changes Pura's mind about that at all. But Pura set this up to punish both utilities from the get-go when they open two dockets. One is a full and fair investigation, and the second one is the discussion of what the penalty will be after the full and fair investigation has been determined. That kind of clues you in that there may have been some pre-thought as to how the first hearing was going to go. And that's me editorializing. Chuck didn't say any of that, and nor am I paid by Eversource to say any of that. That's just one man's opinion.
So I mentioned at the beginning of this meeting that in July we'll be having some speakers on renewables, and two of the speakers will be from Eversource, and you'll be hearing about some of the good things that we're doing to try to help the environment.
That will be fantastic. And Eversource is doing, well, Eversource and Ørsted are doing a bunch with renewable energy. And so I'm looking forward to that in July.
Okay. Anything else for Lee before he takes off his crown? Oh, it's gone. I can see deerskin. All right, next up, pinch hitting, not only pinch hitting, but doing all of the hitting for the waste team is Mark. Harold is not able to be with us today. So Mark, I'll turn it over to you.
Thank you. And I believe Ashley is going to assist and cover some of the items that Harold had contributed to the report. So Ashley, would you like to go first?
I will follow your lead.
Okay. Well, I'll just start out by mentioning the topic that Ashley is going to cover is the release reporting regulations. And we have material in the handout on pages 1 and 2. Update on the Transfer Act Working Group. There's a new web page created by DEEP and DECD. And so you can follow any developments on the website that will presumably address some of the changes to be made specifically with respect to sections 15 through 23. So there's more work to be done in advance of the next session of the General Assembly. And with regard to the EUR regulations, there are a number of forms yet to be developed. So that, I think, is going to be a significant activity on the part of DEEP. And as was mentioned earlier, the public comment period ended on May 10th. So we have a sort of a mini wave 3 coming up with those new forms yet to be developed. And I'd like to highlight something that I think is interesting relative to the pending closure of the Mira waste energy facility in Hartford. And it appears that there will be or is currently a dispute between the DEEP and the Mira organization with respect to whether or not transfer of waste from the Hartford facility is already authorized, or whether Mira is obligated to submit a new permit application for either a new permit or permit modification. And there was an interesting article which appeared in the Connecticut Mirror quoting both Robert Eisner from DEEP and Mira President Tom Kirk, So we may have a historic challenge between a quasi state agency and a state agency over many hundreds of thousands of tons of waste and what will happen with the Mira facility. So the sad news is once Mira closes, we have stranded over 400,000 tons of waste every year, which may require transport out of state, likely will require transport out of state. And the state agency, which is prepared to basically close down both the waste energy facility and then the recycling facility in Hartford. So it will result in significant additional costs to businesses, institutions, residents, the towns that are members of the Mira organization. My understanding is that Mira is now embarking on preparing requests for proposals for out-of-state disposal. A number of the Mira towns are either dropping out or have already dropped out and plan to go their own way in terms of securing services. So we'll be providing updates on that, but I think it has a significant impact on not only costs and service for waste disposal, but also transportation. Because as the materials are loaded into trailers and moved out of state on highways, I think we can expect to see very heavy truck traffic on the roads, and that may go on for years. I have a note in the handout regarding DEEP waste reduction activities. They've embarked on a program with municipalities that they refer to as the CCS-MM, Comprehensive Materials. I don't even remember, I'm filled with acronyms, but CCS-MM was a collaboration among DEEP to initiate and further discussion of alternatives to disposal, including increasing recycling, pay-as-you-throw or unit-based pricing, composting of food scraps and food waste, and extended producer responsibility, which may entail fees to manufacturers or producers of products for packaging of their materials. Finally, I'll just briefly mention that with respect to the tax credits available for alternative energy sources, specifically green energy, wind, solar, hydro, and biomass, there's a potential for eliminating the generation of electricity from waste energy facilities from eligibility under the IRS Section 45 tax code, which would, in many opinion, people in the industry believe would be detrimental to growth and the viability of these facilities in the United States. So there are less than 100 facilities remaining in operation. Two major companies, Wheelabrator and Covanta, are still active in the industry, but a number of plants have closed. And if those tax credits are not available to waste energy facilities, we will likely see more closures of facilities because the economics are just not there. With prices for the power being under 3 cents a kilowatt hour, in many cases, it's just not adequate to cover the cost of operating these facilities. So stay tuned. That's under consideration in the Congressional House and Ways, the Ways and Means Committee, chaired by Richard Neal of Massachusetts. And I believe hearings are scheduled next week. So one of the reasons why the waste energy may be excluded is because of unfavorable view of the industry by environmental groups. And lately, there's been increasing linkage between the environmental groups, their opposition, and the fact that many of the waste energy facilities are located in areas considered to be sensitive to environmental justice topics, including respiratory illnesses, the prevalence of these facilities in neighborhoods of color or low income. And so there's been this association between the location of these facilities, the pollutants they emit, and their location that's driving some of the opposition. And it's unfortunate because the industry is doing well in the UK and the EU, and it's very, very much adopted and promoted in Europe, but in North America, not so much. So with that, I'll turn it over to Ashley or take questions if anybody has any questions. It's all yours, Ashley.
Yeah, so as I mentioned before, we had the public comment for the spill regs and some of the things that we brought up as CBIA with a bunch of input from all of you. The other area is the release-based working groups. The subcommittees are wrapping up and should be getting their consensus reports to the full working group. And just for anyone who isn't on this working group or subcommittees, this is the group that's transitioning us over from the Transfer Act to a release-based system. So we should have consensus papers for June 11th. And after following all 5 subcommittees, pretty much every subcommittee is on track. And also, if anyone on here has anything to add in terms of the release-based working groups, feel free to chime in. Once all the consensus papers are brought in, the goal is to have the working group poke through the papers, and Deep will also be taking a look at those. And then it's still a little unclear as to the next steps, but there is going to be a phase 2 of subcommittees to take on the next level of creating the system. So if anybody who is a chair or is on those subcommittees has anything to add, feel free. Hearing none. Take it back over to Mark unless there's anything else anyone has any questions on.
Okay, I guess one last thing relative to implementation or adoption of any of the legislative proposals. We have that, I believe it's Senate Bill 1037. Ashley, is that something you've been covering?
Yes.
Okay. And that pared down quite a bit of proposals that the DEEP initially favored. So I think that at least what I'm hearing is there's some friction between those in the Environment Committee who are favorable towards the recommendations made by Commissioner Dykes and others who are skeptical or oppose some of the proposals. And this is important at this point in time with respect to the future of how Connecticut manages waste material and recyclables with the demise of the Mira organization. And any questions? I'll check the chat room. Chuck, do you see anything?
I don't see anything.
Okay.
All right. Thank you, Ashley. Thank you, Mark. We'll turn it over to our airheads, Dave and Steve.
Thanks, Chuck. So not a ton of news to report this month, but just a few things that Steve and I have for you guys. There was at the end of April, EPA has proposed a phase out of hydrofluorocarbon refrigerants. Now this is the second go around of this phase down. They originally proposed this, I think, back in 2016, and that was knocked back. But this time around, it's being put forth under the American Innovation and Manufacturing Act, which specifically has that authority, unlike in the past where the EPA proposed it under Title VI of the Clean Air Act, which was specific to protecting depletion of the ozone layer, whereas the HFCs don't do that, but they do have a high global warming potential and have climate impacts. So unlike the controversy in the past was their regulatory authority was questionable under that particular section of the Clean Air Act, but right now they clearly have that authority under this statute. But so that's a gradual phase out of the manufacture of these compounds, but it'll be interesting to see what happens after that. So this does not apply to end use leak repair and other work practices that end users of refrigeration appliances have to follow for things that contain class 1 and class 2 refrigerants. But this may be an indicator of those requirements applying to HFCs down the road. So we'll see where that goes. But and then just another federal thing to be aware of. There was a Clean Air Act cost benefit rule that came out late last year that has just been rescinded. So in the past, under the Clean Air Act and as part of a cost benefit analysis, this temporary rule that was in effect at the end of last year dialed back, it restricted a lot of what EPA was allowed to consider when completing a cost benefit analysis for new regulations. And I think one of the bigger ones is associated benefits for air quality and human health. So, for example, if there were a regulation to control NOx or SO2 or particulate matter, but as a result of that rule, less fuel was burned, and there was a climate related benefit as well, EPA would consider that as a benefit in their cost benefit analysis. And this rule late last year, that was one of the things that they dialed back as being eligible for consideration as part of that. But that's only been around for a couple of months, and now that has been rescinded. So basically it's just going back to the way EPA had been doing that before, and assuming that this rescinded rule doesn't come back in the future. But I guess they are still potentially considering comments and holding a hearing. So I guess anything can happen on that too. And just lastly, on the first page of our table, the just for those interested, the OTC is having their annual meeting. That's coming up in June 15th. No agenda yet, so but it is open to the public. It's free, and so if anyone's interested, feel free to participate. We'll see what comes out of that. Haven't heard much from them lately, but every so often they'll kick out model rules that that the member states will work to implement into their air program. So so just to be aware of that. So I think that's the stuff I want to touch on. And Steve, I think you have a couple updates for Title V folks.
Thanks, Dave. Next slide, please. This is just a reminder that it's ozone season. It started on May 1st. The slide has really all the information about it. And we've found, and I've found from my experience for all the years, the best way to do this is have the DEP email you the forecast the previous day. And remember, it doesn't apply to all emergency generators. It depends on how big your site is, if you're major, non-major, and how big the engine is that you utilize and where you're located in a serious or severe area. For other items, for those of you that are Title V facilities, the annual fees, the invoices are being sent out starting today till next Wednesday. And if you're having COVID-related mail problems, just give Rick Rodrigue or Steve Potter an email or phone call and ask them. They'll send you an electronic version of your invoice. And it looks like, and I'm sure everybody from the other media already know this, that it doesn't look like we're getting extensions this year. At this time, July 1st is when your fee will be due. Also, we've heard that the DEP, they should be coming back to their offices in the next month. And also, from what we've heard, it sounds like the inspectors are slowly migrating back out into the field, and it all is based on what kind of issue that they're going out to view and what type of source you have. But I think pretty soon, the next few months, we'll see them back in normal operation mode. And lastly, if any of you have ever dealt with the TRC Air Group over the last 42 years, Ray Tapazio is retiring. And it's always been a pleasure dealing with him. He's been great. And if he owes any of you a report, I'd get a hold of him in the next 2 or 3 weeks, because after that, he might not care too much. And that's about it, Chuck.
Okay.
For air issues.
Great. Thank you very much. Anything else for the good of the order from anybody on the call? Speak now, forever hold your peas. I used to hold my peas and never eat them when I was little. Okay, so just as a reminder, we have our annual conference next month. There will not be an August meeting. So that's correct, right, Marcy?
That is correct.
Okay, so you can block that off on your schedule if you had, or block the block off. So, and that's it. And so be safe. Thank you very much. Enjoy what's supposed to be another magical weekend in paradise. Thanks.
Great weekend, everyone.